Your next major project will be your persuasive speech. And so today we want to talk about what persuasion is, how persuasion functions, how we can be more persuasive, and how to use reasoning and evidence in the presentation of your argument. First, what is persuasion? Persuasion is the process of creating, reinforcing, or changing the belief or actions of your audience. First major difference in your informative speech and your persuasive speech is the purpose. The general purpose of your informative speech was to inform. In that case, you were a teacher. You were conveying information. There wasn't a bias to what you had to say. In a persuasive speech, you are an advocate. You are trying to change the way we think or change the way we behave. Now, this is something we do all the time. If you've ever convinced your parents to let you do something that they told you initially you couldn't do, if you ever persuaded someone to help you do something they didn't necessarily want to do, you have persuaded people. And so it's a skill as old as time itself. People have been persuading since the beginning of time, when the serpent persuaded Eve and Adam to eat that fruit in the garden. Persuasion has been from the beginning. And it's a skill we all need to understand and use well, but use ethically. We talked about ethical speaking during Unit 1, and that ethical speaking becomes of paramount importance when you're trying to change the way somebody thinks or the way someone behaves. When you are trying to elicit a change in someone, you need to make especially sure that you're doing it in an ethical manner. So first of all, you have to make sure that your goals, your purpose is ethical. You are not trying to persuade someone to do something that will get them hurt or that will do damage to them. Secondly, you need to make sure that you are seeking out viewpoints and other viewpoints and making sure that you have adequate information to prove your point. And the third thing you've got to be sure of when you are speaking to persuade is that you are being honest, that you are reporting to us what the evidence says, that you're not trying to use a lie, that you're not trying to use false information to elicit the change that you seek. In persuasive speaking, there is a dialogue that occurs. When you did your informative speech, you were simply conveying information, and there was a passivity on the part of your audience. But the persuasive speech preassumes that you are talking to people who are not in agreement with you. You would not need to persuade them if they already thought or were already doing what you're trying to accomplish in them. And so there is this unspoken dialogue, this unspoken give and take that occurs between the speaker and the listener. It's a much more active version of the speaking model that we talked about in Unit 1. The speaker is anticipating the arguments that the listener would have to oppose the speaker's viewpoint, and then trying to undermine or diffuse them with evidence and reasoning. And so there's this emotional, mental, psychological give and take that occurs throughout the persuasive speech. Part of the process of persuasion is recognizing your target audience, the portion of the whole audience that the speaker most wants to persuade to his point of view. In your average audience, you're going to have three groups of people. You're going to have the people who already agree with you. You're going to have the people who already disagree with you. And you're going to have the people whose minds might be swayed, who live in that kind of in-between where they might be willing to go along with what you say and they might not. And so this becomes your target audience. You're probably not going to sway those who are so set in their minds that they're already against you. You don't need to persuade those who are already so set in their mind they're on your side. But you need to be aiming at that group that could be persuaded to lean your way. That becomes your target audience, and that's who you go after as you're seeking to persuade your audience. There are three types of persuasive speeches. The first of these is a speech on questions of fact. There are certain questions that can be answered with a specific answer that is either right or wrong. What is the longest river in the world? Who won the World Series in 2014? Who won the popular election in... There are answers that we know, these are questions that we know the answers to. There are some questions, though, that the answers are more ambiguous. Who was responsible for the assassination of John F. Kennedy? Was it a conspiracy? Was it one man acting alone? What happened to the settlers of Roanoke Island in North Carolina? What happened to the crew of the Andrea Doria? These are mysteries that we've never had answers. The kinds of questions that we analyze when we do a persuasive speech on a question of fact. If I was doing a speech to persuade you that it was a conspiracy that killed John F. Kennedy, I would look to evidence that there was a shooter on the grassy knoll, or evidence that there might have been another shooter on another building besides the Texas School Book Depository. I might talk to you about the likelihood that someone with as little military training as Lee Harvey Oswald could have made 3 shots from the time he did from the Texas School Book Depository. I could seek to persuade you that the evidence tells us that it is a conspiracy. On the other hand, I could seek to persuade you that it was a lone gunman. This is a question of fact. And typically, the organizational method for speeches analyzing questions of fact is a topical organization. The next type of persuasive speech is a speech analyzing a question of value. And these kinds of speeches are questions about the worth, rightness, and morality of an idea or action. Questions like, what is the best movie of all time? Is solitary confinement an appropriate punishment? Is abortion to save the mother justifiable? These are all questions of... These questions are not only considerations of fact, they're considerations of value judgments. Is it just to put someone in solitary confinement where they are by themselves for days and months on end? Is that moral and right, or is it cruel and unusual punishment? There is no clear-cut answer. We have to make, for these speeches to be persuasive, for these ideas to be persuasive, though, we have to do more than just say, well, I think it's wrong. I think it's right. We have to explain why we believe it's wrong. We have to give the reasoning behind our judgment that it's cruel and unusual punishment, or that abortion is right in the case of saving the mother. We have to give evidence. And when it comes to the organization of speeches on question of value, the organization, again, is almost always topical. The final type of persuasive speech are speeches on questions of policy. A question of policy is a question about whether a specific course of action should or should not be taken. Now, these types of speeches can have 2 possible different approaches. The first of these is a speech to gain passive agreement, a persuasive speech in which the speaker's goal is to convince the audience that a given policy is desirable without encouraging the audience to take action in support of the policy. The second is a speech to gain immediate action, a persuasive speech in which the speaker's goal is to convince the audience to take action in support of a given policy. When you analyze this problem of a question of policy, there are 3 things that you need to address. You first need to recognize a need. You need to have a problem that needs to be addressed. Second, you need to have a plan on how to address the policy. And third, you need to demonstrate that your plan is practical. Without practicality, there's no way you can persuade an audience to undertake your proposal. There are several approaches to organizing a speech that seeks to gain immediate action. The first of these organizational patterns is called the problem-solution organization. here is the problem, this is what we're facing, here is the solution on how to handle it. It's basically a two-pronged organization. The second organizational method often used in these kinds of speeches is a problem cause solution, a three-pronged attempt in which you explain what the problem is, what caused the problem, and how we can solve the problem. Then we have the comparative advantages solution. This is where you look at several different solutions to the problem and prove why your solution is better than your opponent's solution. You are looking at the comparative advantages of your solution rather than your adversary's. Finally, we have a particularly effective form of organizing persuasive speeches called Monroes motivated sequence. Alan Monroe was a communications professor at Purdue University in the 1930s, and in his course he developed this organizational approach. There are 5 components to Monroe's motivated sequence. First, you get the audience's attention. You use one of the techniques we've talked about in earlier lectures, but you get the audience's attention. Then, you spell out to the audience the need. You explain the problem that exists for your audience. Next, you provide satisfaction. You show the audience how that problem can be solved. Then you have the audience visualize. You paint a picture of what the world would be like if your solution was put into action. You make them see it. You make them want it. And finally, you spell out an action that you want that audience to perform. The way to achieve that solution is for you to do this. So, to summarize, we've talked about what persuasion is. We've talked about the mental dialogue that goes on in the persuasion process. We've talked about recognizing your target audience. And then we've talked about the different kinds of persuasive speeches. Speeches analyzing questions of fact, speeches analyzing questions of value, and speeches analyzing questions of policy. And then finally, we looked at ways to organize those speeches, particularly Monroe's motivated sequence. All right, in our next lecture, we're going to talk about methods of persuasion, how we use credibility, evidence, and logic to make our case. And we're going to look at some of the logical fallacies that occur when we use logic incorrectly. All right, thanks, guys. Have a good day. Bye.